This month on The Compliance Life, I visit with Valerie Charles. Valerie has one of the most interesting journeys to and from the CCO chair. After sitting in the CCO chair, she realized the need for an integrated tech solution for compliance, so she went to a tech startup, GAN Integrity. She then moved to consulting at StoneTurn. We conclude this month with Valerie Charles on The Compliance Life by looking at the CCO function in 2025 and beyond. I know you'll enjoy this month on The Compliance Life. In this concluding episode 4, Valerie looks at 2025 and beyond for compliance.
The Compliance Life details the journey to and in the role of a Chief Compliance Officer. How does one come to sit in the CCO chair? What are some of the skills a CCO needs to successfully navigate the compliance waters in any company? What are some of the top challenges CCOs have faced, and how did they meet them? These questions and many others will be explored in this new podcast series. The Compliance Life is hosted by Tom Fox, and each month he'll present the story of one CCO through 4 episodes. The Compliance Life is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
We're going to have a quick word from our sponsor, and they'll be right back with Valerie Charles on The Compliance Life. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for our final episode with Valerie Charles, this month's guest on The Compliance Life. Valerie, first of all, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
So, Valerie, on this episode, I wanted to maybe ask you to put on your prognosticator hat, Karnak the Magnificent, or whatever hat you might have to look at compliance down the road and the CCO position down the road. You've been in this field now for 10 plus years, and you've moved through a variety of frankly, disparate careers that give you, I think, a unique perspective. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is, where do you see the Chief Compliance Officer position in the corporate world?
Well, I think the first thing to say somewhat clearly is that the role is going to become more important. I mean, it already has. I think there was a time when compliance was the redheaded stepchild to legal. I think that time has passed. I think, people used to think about compliance just as just regulatory compliance, kind of, hall monitoring, making sure that, kind of ERISA or OSHA or something like that. That's what would come to mind. And I'm not saying that those things are not important, but it's just part of a larger movement, I think, to understand that, compliance is very special in that it's tied into legal, it's tied into HR, it's tied into finance. I mean, you can't do compliance without controls, and controls, at least the financial controls, often mean that you have to work with the finance team or the controller. And I just think that this role, as we start to look at businesses more holistically, and as the government begins to expect businesses to know more about what's going on in the business outside of your particular silo in the particular corner of the world that you work in within the organization, I think that the compliance officer and the compliance function is going to be very well situated to kind of help lead that charge. I feel pretty strongly that this is happening kind of right before our eyes. I mean, the last 5 years, I think, has been a pretty big shift for compliance people generally.
Earlier, I've also heard you talk, indeed, throughout this podcast series, you've talked about your own evolution in the evaluation of data, in the collection of data, and the analysis of data, and using data. And then in episode 3, you talked about how you and your team and colleagues at StoneTurn were able to put disparate data to use in a way that might not have been immediately apparent. Do you see the use of data continuing to be an important part of the overall corporate compliance program? And if so, where do you see that going down the road?
I think absolutely. I think that, the concept of data, again, I mean, I've said this, I think, in another episode, but it's it's daunting for people who don't come from a background where you're sort of comfortable talking about data or thinking about data analytics. And what I like about my role, I work at Stone Turn with a bunch of partners who are just incredibly smart. And, the data analytics folks that I work with, do things and think of things in ways that I can't. But what I can do is sort of be a conduit to the clients that I have and help people start to brainstorm and think about, where does information sit that if I were utilizing it, if I were really leveraging all of the data sets that I have or could have access to, that I maybe don't have access to today, but that if I went and asked for, I could have, what are the possibilities? And it's fun. It's a creative job. And the data part of it and how to use the data, is an incredibly creative exercise. And it's fun. I mean, I'm working with a couple clients right now that are really doing some very innovative things that I think once we shake them out and really, show the ROI from it, hopefully do some sort of a case study, these will become things that become attractive for other businesses and eventually will become the norm that everybody's doing. I mean, I just think, it's kind of like there's always been this concept of the things that we do on the front end. We do training, we create policies, we create procedures, those are kind of front end activities for compliance, and then on the back end, we have controls and we, test them sometimes and see how they're working. And that's kind of it, this front end, back end. But I think there's been missing the kind of larger picture of figuring out how do we look at data and how it's moving in real time? How do we give access to data sets for different functions through a lens that is relevant to each function? So you're not just kind of looking at, financial data through a financial lens. You're looking at financial data through a compliance lens that's relevant to you. And you can look at it at the same time that finance looks at it through their own lens and it's useful to them and it's all real time. That sort of general concept, I think, very much changes how businesses are going to operate. And I think this holistic view, I mean, it's relevant for compliance. I also think it's relevant, as we think more about, ESG and just in general, creating workplaces that are, compliant with laws and regulations, but also, kind of have the whole package, considering everything. How does this affect the environment? How does this affect the workplace culture? I think compliance is going to be at the table as we continue to evolve, as the American business community continues to evolve.
Valerie, where do you see the role of compliance in a corporate ESG effort, if any?
It's interesting. On LinkedIn, you have your friends and mine who argue, I think, a little bit about whether or not compliance ought to own ESG. To me personally, the ESG concept is so broad. Like, should you have an ESG program? Yes, but is it something that you can create and stand alone? No. I mean, it necessarily has to be operationalized. It has to be a partnership that involves a lot of different business units and functions. And I think compliance will have an important role. I think in some organizations, it will not make sense to have, standalone function for ESG. And I think in some of those instances, the compliance person probably will be able to take it on. I think in other organizations, particularly organizations that have more complex environmental piece, if you're really tracking climate control and carbon emissions and a lot of these things, I think that ESG probably does deserve its own C-level person at the table. And I think in larger organizations that we'll see that happening. I think we're already seeing that happening with C-level sustainability officers, things like that. But I think compliance will always be important to it, regardless. I don't think I have an answer about whether or not I think it should report to compliance. In general, I think probably not, but I think in a lot of organizations it will take quite a while. And in the meantime, compliance is probably properly situated to handle it.
Valerie, throughout this podcast series, you've not only talked about different types of discipline that you've worked with in the compliance function. You've certainly talked about data and getting a handle on that and becoming more comfortable with it. And you talked about a project you did with a client where you looked at behavioral data, which was housed in HR. I was wondering if you might sort of conclude by what are your thoughts on what a corporate compliance function, what types of disciplines should they have in it in the future? So should it be a data scientist? Should it be a behavioral psychologist? Should it be someone else that, not a lawyer, perhaps didn't grow up in compliance and has a different background than someone like you or me?
I'm not in the camp of people who think that compliance leaders have to be data scientists. I think good compliance leaders are going to be good business-minded people. And I think it's okay if you come from law, and I think it's okay if you don't come from law. I think even if you take away the sort of data developments in compliance has always been about, making decisions for the business on the whole, and then operationalizing those decisions, which necessarily involves partnering with the business, because we're not overhauling what people are doing. We're coming up with, realistic ways to address risk in the organization by understanding what is the sales team doing today? What is realistic change to make in the right direction that people are not going to buck, people will actually do. And sometimes it's inching it forward. Sometimes it's saying, okay, well, we're going to implement this change this year and see how that goes. And if we can get, compliance with what we're trying to do here, then we're going to try to move it an inch again next year. I think you have to be able to play the long game. You have to be able to understand the business and human motivations. And frankly, I do think there is a component of standing up and being a strong leader. Just like anybody who's working in any cost center in the business, you do have to kind of fight for your function. And I think compliance is going to continue to have good, strong leaders, who can think in multidisciplinary ways and work with a lot of different types of people. The data aspect, yes, the more dollars and headcount we can get for data people in compliance, in my opinion, it's power, right? Information is power, and data is information. Data is power. I love it. But at the same time, I don't think it's going to turn into a job that is that requires a data science degree.
So Valerie, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time, but before we conclude this fourth and final episode, I have a special bonus question for you, which was, you said you were a dancer when you were growing up. And I was wondering if you could talk about, and I've seen some LinkedIn posts where you started to dip your toe back in to the dance arena. So I was wondering if you could talk about, dancing, what dancing brought you or gave you, why you're dipping your toe back in now, and maybe why you still have such an obvious passion for it. And for those not watching this podcast, which of course is everyone since it's an audio podcast, Valerie just had the biggest smile she's had in all 4 episodes when I brought up dancing. So it's obviously a passion. So talk to us a little bit about Valerie the dancer.
Well, I think it taught me maybe time management. I think it taught me discipline. I tend to be kind of a fly by the seat creative type in general. And I think, studying dance and studying ballet and knowing that you can't skip, there's no cutting corners, right? You can't start doing the big things before you do the small things. I think really it defines very much, I think, a lot of my personality, and my kid has now just started ballet lessons as well. And it's kind of just a fun trip in time to, be hanging out with a 4-year-old taking ballet. And, why am I back to it? I just feel, I guess, a little bit like, I spent my 20s and 30s studying law and, traveling and just being nuts in my career. And I'm still nuts in my career, but I feel like it was important a little bit to kind of get back to something that makes me feel really centered and kind of calm. And so that's why I'm dipping my toe back in. But yeah, look, I love the arts. I mean, I don't think it has to be dance in particular. I think we all benefit from kind of sinking into the arts in whatever way, you feel compelled to do it.
Well, Valerie, this has just been a great time for me. I love doing this podcast. I get to sit down and have a virtual cup of coffee with somebody who gets to tell me their story. I've heard parts of your story over the years, but I've never heard it in the way we've found out about it in these 4 podcast episodes. So I really wanted to thank you for taking the time to share your story with me about your journey in compliance.
Well, it was a lot of fun for me too, Tom. And I appreciate the invitation. I really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Thank you again for listening to this episode of The Compliance Life. I hope you'll join me again next week where I take up another episode in The Compliance Life. The Compliance Life is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. If you would like to be featured on The Compliance Life, please give me an email at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Also, if you like this series, please give us a rating on iTunes. Any review and rating would definitely help get the word out about the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network. Thanks again.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.